In the blink of an eye, France is already into the final days of campaigning, a speed dating exercise that's got the far right more than ever knocking on the doors of power. Polls suggest that Emmanuel Macron's surprise decision to dissolve parliament just 2 weeks ago has not, at least not yet, sparked any rethink. On the contrary, Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella continue to carry the momentum from their record tally from European elections earlier this month. In fact, a full 1/4 of voters told an Ipsos poll for the Financial Times that they trust the National Rally Party more on the economy than Macron's centrists or the left-wing alliance. Other than an unconstitutional pledge to reduce benefits and public services for immigrants, the party that once spooked voters with its now defunct call to leave the euro still remains fuzzy, say critics, on how it'll pay for all its campaign promises. So, why this leap of faith? Under Macron's, unemployment is down, foreign investment is up. However, a soaring cost of living has stoked genuine fears that middle-class families could slide into poverty. Put the far right's great replacement theory to one side. For these citizens, it feels like a great demotion. Who best to address their genuine concerns? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at this great divide that the French are feeling. With us, Francesco Saracino, professor at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, and Lewis University in Rome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Cyprien Battu is economist for the Avant-Garde Institute think tank. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
From Lancaster in England, Renaud Foucard, senior lecturer in economics at Lancaster University. Good to see you.
Good evening.
And from London, Ben Hall, Europe editor for the Financial Times. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
You can watch the show, or if you're on the go, you can listen, like, and subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. After the left last Friday, this Monday was the turn of the far right to spell out its platform. After already changing its stance on raising the retirement age, raising on the war in Ukraine, the National Rally mostly playing its cards close to its chest, 6 days out from the first round of those legislative elections. Emerald Maxwell has more.
The poster boy for the far-right National Rally, who's helping to detoxify the party's extremist image.
En 3 mots, nous sommes prêts.
Jordan Bardella wants to win an outright majority in upcoming polls to allow his party to implement its Eurosceptic, anti-immigration, law and order program.
Our priorities will be to boost purchasing power, restore security throughout the country, and get our immigration policy back on track. We'll be taking action in the first few weeks.
Laying out his policies if elected, Bardella said he would cut energy taxes and make it harder for people born on French soil to gain citizenship.
I intend to abolish birthright nationality. The automatic acquisition of French nationality is no longer justified in a world of 8 billion people.
There is currently no automatic acquisition of nationality for children born in France to foreign parents, although they may be able to acquire it later in life with a number of strings attached. Bardella also promised more authority in schools, including a ban on mobile phones and trialling school uniforms, a proposal previously put forward by Emmanuel Macron. Weekend polls showed the National Rally garnering around 35% of voting intentions in the first round, ahead of the left-wing alliance and Macron's centrists in third place. Macron's Prime Minister, Gabriel Attal, said the National Rally was going back on some of their flagship policies, like abolishing VAT on basic necessities and getting out of the European electricity market.
They're like a windscreen wiper because they're not ready. The National Rally is an opposition party, not a governing party.
Gabriel Attal is set to take on Jordan Bardella and left-wing leaders in TV debates Tuesday and Thursday.
Francesco Saracino, the far right, it had an incarnation under Jean-Marie Le Pen where it was almost libertarian in its free market approach. Then it became more social with a big implantation in the Rust Belt North. What does it stand for?
Well, they stand for getting to power, so they'll do whatever it takes to be there. And I mean, you just pointed to a major contradiction, I think. They present themselves as the party of, let's say, High Street against Wall Street, to make a metaphor from the United States. And then, like in many other cases, I'm Italian, and of course I know very well the Italian situation. Like in many other cases, once they're in power, they usually don't fulfill the promises to protect the middle class. So
the level of promises you saw in that report, is that akin to what we heard from Giorgia Meloni before
it's quite
the
similar.
Italian general election?
So, I mean, of course, I mean, we are in a different moment right now than we were when Meloni was elected 2 years ago. But I mean, more or less, that is exactly what they said. I mean, the big finance is killing the standard of living of the middle classes. We are squeezed between immigrants and third world countries pushing, and the very rich who steal with their rents. And so the only way to protect our middle classes that are sliding towards poverty is to close the borders. I mean, this is why they keep alive this topic of immigration, and of course having more social programs. I mean, the only practical thing he said is that he will reduce the VAT on energy goods. That is the only thing that apparently will do right away, and this is typically something that is meant to be seen as protecting the middle classes. In fact, it's not, because if you reduce VAT, you reduce it for everybody, including the very rich. So they should target it much better. But I mean, if you want, the communication strategy is absolutely clear. Okay, we are here to protect the middle classes that are left behind by this globalized world in which big finance and the emerging economies and poor economies are squeezing us.
Ben Hall, let's bring on the bear. That survey that was published in your newspaper, compiled by Ipsos, more than 2,000 people polled. 25% of the French think that Marine Le Pen's party would trust them more on the economy than the others. What do you make of this graph?
Well, I think it's truly quite remarkable, given that this is a party with a very fuzzy economic program that has promised large tax cuts and some big spending commitments in the past, but doesn't really have a way of funding them at all beyond the vague promise that by cutting immigration and cutting benefits to immigrants, it can save lots of money. It's not very credible, and yet the French people seem to find it more credible than they do the other parties' policies. And I think
so is that trust irrational?
Well, that's clearly what Macron thinks, which is why I think he tried to call this election to sort of shock the French out of their, as he put it, fever, therefore out of their irrational thinking. But it certainly doesn't seem to be working according to our survey and the surveys of voting intentions. But what I found remarkable in this survey was that even those things where Macron's government has had a very good record, for example, on reducing unemployment down to a 15-year low, I think, until it ticked up last year, they still rate the Rassemblement National better than they do Macron's centrist alliance, even though it doesn't seem to have a policy on unemployment at all. So there's clearly, I think the thing that came out in this survey was the complete rejection of the governing parties at the moment and their credibility. And that's what seems so remarkable about it. And it does feel to me like it's not based on rational fact and is driven more by a general rejection of the incumbents.
Rejection of the elites? Is this a Brexit moment, you might ask?
I think a lot of people would draw a very similar parallel. Although what you might say about Brexit was that it's a lot more complicated and a lot harder for people to get their head around the costs and the benefits and what British people had to lose from leaving the EU. But it definitely feels like one of those moments, an anti-elite moment, an anti-experts moment, if you remember that during the Brexit campaign when Michael Gove, one of the big pro-Brexit campaigners, said the British people had enough of experts who were saying that Brexit would leave the country poorer. And of course, it has left the country poorer. The experts were right. I think most people now realize is true. So I think you can see the parallels for sure.
Renaud Foucard, let me ask you, you published a piece recently in The Conversation entitled 4 Tips to Avoid Being Bamboozled by Political Statistics and Data. We could talk till the cows come home about what the opinion surveys mean in an election where it's not one national race, but 577 constituencies over 2 rounds. But my question for you is more over something Ben said a moment ago about the metrics. He talked about unemployment down to a 15-year low. Are we measuring the wrong metrics these days?
Well, I guess in a democracy, the only metric that matters is what the electorate will say. But in a way, I think there is something that is very similar in France and also in the US at the moment, that what people feel about the economy is not necessarily what the indicators show. And in the case of Emmanuel Macron, I think something that was even worse, and it's largely because of Emmanuel Macron, is that because he managed to be the only one with a reasonable center in politics, with only the far left, the far right visible against him, voters have heard a lot of nonsense, a lot of economic nonsense. During the pension reform debate, they could have had a serious debate about the way Macron did it. It was not at all ideal. But the problem is that there was no discussion of trade-off. No one was ever willing to talk about trade-off. And Macron has managed to have in front of him people who are never held accountable for what they will do. There is no shadow Rassemblement National cabinet. There is no half-an-hour interview with the leader of the Rassemblement National about energy markets. So everything is largely about feeling, vibes, and voters have heard for years that it would be so easy to descend this.
But couldn't I, if I was being facetious here, couldn't I say that the Labour Party is employing the same strategy right now? They're on the cusp of victory, and their leader has decided to say as little as possible about what he'll do.
Well, the Labour Party has done, I think, exactly the opposite as the Rassemblement National. People would say they've been extremely shy about pushing new policies. And because they've been so shy about policy, people are saying, well, you don't want to do anything about us, and still they're going to win. But Rassemblement National has been pushing crazy policies, and at the same time, nobody seemed to mention, for instance, in energy policy, that France has protected its consumer much better than any other country. But people were not ready to listen to that because there was no reasonable opposition, no central opposition.
Let me bring you in on this, Cyprien Battu, because I know that energy policy is something that you look at specifically, and your thoughts when you look at those concerns and the by the way, there's another element. We could show the graph from that Ipsos poll for the FT. They trust the French, they trust the Rassemblement National to handle the economy better, but also the second survey that shows that social issues are what's the biggest preoccupation of the electorate. So what does that mean, social issues? What does economic issues mean?
I think it's all a question of relative positions and what happened since 2021 in France. So in 2021, there was massive price shock. And in fact, indeed, it was better to be a middle class in France than in some other European countries. If you look at what happened in inflation.
It was mostly energy costs that soared, right?
Yes, mostly energy costs at first. Then when the inflation touched spread in the economy over other items. But
yeah, and that is important because we're seeing the same thing in the United States where people are really feeling the pinch when they buy food at the supermarket.
Yes.
The price has gone up a lot.
Yes, the price has gone up a lot, but less in France relatively to other European countries. And in terms of growth also, the performance of France has not been the worst. So it was not the worst thing to be a middle class in France since 2021. But, and that is really important here, there was a relative demotion of the middle classes in France. Why? First of all, there was indeed a massive increase in public spending to face this price shock through energy price caps, but also other emergency measures that were untargeted. So that's why public spending.
What do you mean by untargeted?
It means everyone had the same help from the government, more or less. Okay, so that was
the price of gas. The rich and the poor,
yes,
they all have the same.
They all profited from more or less the same. But also, you need to look at incomes as well. So, and in France, social benefits, but also the minimum wage, are indexed to inflation. So when you take those two things, okay, the incomes from the poorest deciles actually more or less keep track to inflation and even increase a little bit. And also the incomes from the richest households also increase, but because of the increase in housing prices, okay? But what happened is that there was indeed a relative and absolute impoverishment from the middle classes. And that's maybe key here for the...
So that's the metrics we're not discussing, is what you're saying. We can point too much to... we look too much at unemployment, not enough at this spending power issue.
Yes. We need to look also at purchasing power, but also relative purchasing powers. So indeed, that can be seen, that can be felt as a relative dimension from the middle class.
So among the shocks in the June 9th European elections, there was the surge in far-right support in traditional bastions of the moderate left, like Brittany in the northwest of the country. Newspaper Le Monde employs the French word déclassement. I guess you could call that, it's kind of like saying sliding out of your social class. More pointedly, middle classes that feel squeezed by years of rent increases and soaring energy rates, as Cyprien was saying, and who feel as though they're falling into poverty. Francesco Saracino, talking about unemployment, again, I hark back to this, talking about unemployment at a 15-year low. Go say that to the person who has a job in Brittany but is struggling, really struggling.
Well, I mean, I totally agree with what has been said before. And this is why, I mean, France is just one of the many manifestations of that. I mean, the middle classes have been squeezed almost everywhere. There was a very famous curve proposed by two economists, Milanovic and Lackner, who showed it was the elephant curve that showed that in the game of globalization, the winners are the global middle classes, which is basically the middle classes in emerging countries, and the very rich. And the losers are the rich, relatively rich, which are our middle classes. So our middle classes are squeezed. There is so this is general. In France, I think, I mean, of course, the French in the room will correct me if I'm wrong. In France, there is something that adds to that, which is the fact that Macron started his first term with a clear idea in mind and tried to convey a message that by reducing taxes on capital and on the very rich, that would cause a general growth of the economy that would benefit everybody.
It did increase foreign direct investment.
Yes, but that is not enough. I mean, the point is that if you reduce taxes to the very rich, they benefit, and the others may or may not. In the case of France, the relative position was lost. So this idea of trickle-down economics that Macron brought about, and what is interesting is that he argued for trickle-down the very same moment Donald Trump did the same thing in 2017 in the United States. And in both cases, it ended up with middle classes that lost ground quite significantly. And so absolute levels of life in the end don't count much. It's much more the relative level. And so the general trend was compounded in France by this idea, by the fact that this was even a theory. He said, I'm reducing taxes on the very rich so that everybody benefits, and this everybody benefits never materialized. I mean, let's not begin that the first major crisis of Macron has been the Gilets jaunes movement, which, by the way, was even not even across income levels, but was also across another very important fault line in France, which is rural versus urban. And so there is also this complication.
Ben Hall, let me ask you, because you've reported a lot from France. On Macron's watch, we've had more recently, as was stated earlier there by Cyprien, the COVID, and then the energy shock prices from the war in Ukraine. But earlier, there was the Yellow Vest movement. There was the pension reform protests. Was there something that Macron missed at that moment?
Yes, I mean, I think there was. I think I would agree with everything that was just said about the fact that his experiment hasn't worked for all French people. I mean, you could, of course, argue the counterfactual that it may have been the same without Macron's tax reforms, and that actually the economy might have been weaker without those tax reforms. You'd have had less inward investment and less, quality jobs, fewer quality jobs. I think what he has missed for me politically is just the way in which his own personal standing has been tarnished by this accumulation of, I don't know whether you would call it sort of ignoring the middle classes or lower middle classes, or not doing enough of them, because by any measure, France has done quite a lot in compensating them for the energy crisis, more than Germany and more than the UK, for sure. But it's clearly not been enough. And I think that, compounded with his sort of political errors and his, unfortunately, what seems to many very arrogant approach to governing, is a sort of very, very powerful cocktail, which you're now seeing play out in the ballot box. And you will see that on Sunday.
We'll see it on Sunday. The first casualty of this campaign, it's attention on the Paris Olympics. First events exactly 1 month from today. On that score, Emmanuel Macron this Monday inaugurating a new metro line extension. France promised sustainable gains, new metro and tram lines. Great news if you live in the greater Paris area. But what about those who live far from the big city and who can't use a tram or a bike lane to get to work? The far right's been tapping into their concern over the cost of environmental norms, like Europe's ban on cars that run from combustion engines starting in the year 2035. The party's vowed to defy what it calls punitive green policies, with promises like a lowering of sales tax on gasoline, as mentioned earlier by Francesco. Cyprien, let me ask you, because this is something you've worked on. Couldn't the policymakers have done this in such a way, because it is punitive, if the way that it's been thought out, this shift away from this green transition?
It's punitive in the sense that the objective is to change behaviors, right? So it needs to be kind of punitive, right? So, but again, in the long run, it's not. So that's what if behavior change, and if investments are made to indeed construct an economy that is greener, it will not be punitive anymore. And even it might be cheaper in the end.
Okay, but if you're living 30 kilometers outside of a small Brittany city like Saint-Brieuc, and you're seeing images of Macron inaugurating a metro line in Paris, what do you feel? What do you say? And you need your car to get to work basically every day, you know?
Yeah. But I mean, I think there are other ways to do it. And that's why, for example, in terms of environmental policies, carbon taxes and so on are not the only solution. You have to complement it with other approaches, and especially measures to accompany this more punitive approach, but I wouldn't use that terms. So you need to think of how you accompany, for example, the sectoral change of the economy, and people who might lose their job because of environmental policies and so on. But it's still these are changes that needs to be implemented, right? I mean,
Renaud Foucault, these are changes that need to be implemented. The planet's heating up. It's probably going to be the hottest month on record this June. But whether it's France, whether it's Germany, people don't like to be told to change their gas boiler if they don't have the money for it, and they don't like to be told to buy an electric car if they don't have the money for that either.
Well, and this is what Cyprien mentioned very well, and Francesco also, about there is at the same time the big problem of rurality versus cities, and most of the big project of Emmanuel Macron, including shifting taxation from labor to carbon, so taxing pollution, that was the start of the Yellow Jacket. So people getting angry because they don't get anything in return. And so typically when you think about making carbon taxes work, it has to be done at the same time as transfer. So if you want to do that seriously, you need to have a plan for Brittany at the same time and say, we're going to tax carbon, we're going to tax cars, but we're going to invest a lot with, for instance, reindustrialization, produce electric car in Brittany, to give you more infrastructure, etc. And maybe it's also linked to the personality of Macron, that because he was so arrogant and people did not trust him, people did not want to listen to what he had to say about that. And this would take another kind of talking to people to manage.
Okay, Renaud Foucault, Macron is arrogant, doesn't sell his policies the best way, but then why is that a reason to go and vote for the far right?
Well, I guess because Macron has destroyed any other reasonable opposition. At the moment, that's what I think the new Popular Front is trying to do by having Social Democrats maybe more visible than before, is that when people have the choice between Macron, Mélenchon, or Macron, Rassemblement National, they've always chosen Macron. That was the idea of let's make blockade to the extreme. But no, this time, maybe people will not do that. And so unless the Social Democrats manage to be strong enough on the other side, there will be a choice between Macron and Rassemblement National, and at some point, some people will say, no, we don't want this choice anymore.
It's as simple as kick the bums out, as Francesco Saracino?
Yes, before I answer, I just wanted to jump in what was said before. The point, I think, is not so much that we need to have this, I agree, punitive measure is not exactly the right way to see it. I mean, the fact that we need to induce or sometimes force some behavior because we have no choice, okay? The point is that this must be one of the many tools we use. And this is really not just a French problem, it's a European problem. The fact that that you implement climate change mostly through regulation without, for example, putting into the green transition the same level of investment, public and private, not just public, that China and the United States are putting, will obviously force people to get out of thermic engines without being able to afford electric cars, or being able to afford electric cars but produced in China, so that then the French or the Germans or the Italians lose their jobs. So the thing that I think our leaders, not just in France, I repeat, are missing right now, is that you cannot just force the ecological transition, but you need to make it an opportunity for growth. This is something that the Chinese have very well understood, and the Americans are very well understood. In Europe, we still have a hard time. In Europe, still, the common perception is this is a cost. Then somebody says we need to bear it. Somebody like the Rassemblement National says we don't want to pay that cost, so we will undo everything, which is, of course, absolutely a crazy position. So the point is, how do we change the public perception and make people understand that we should be able to make the ecological transition an engine for growth. It is one of the major technological shifts, of the past 300 years that is going to happen. And every time in the past that led more growth. It's the scale of that is comparable to the invention of electricity, right? And so why can't we make it an opportunity for growth and well-being instead of making it a cost to society? And that is what our leaders, not just Macron, are failing to convey to the voters.
What's the problem with Europe on that score, Ben Hall?
Well, I mean, I think the basic problem is one of design, which is that Europe doesn't really have the ability to borrow money and to invest. At a federal level, well, it's done it. It did it for the pandemic, and a bit of that money will go to the green transition. It's true, but this needs to be sustained over many years. And in theory, that was just a one-off. So that's one big problem. So unlike the US federal government, it can't borrow and it can't offer large tax incentives, which is what the Biden administration has done to drive this process. And then the second thing is that it has a series of EU fiscal rules, EU-wide fiscal rules, which frankly prevent governments from investing at a national level. And this is driven partly by ideology from the more fiscally prudent states in the north, above all Germany. And you're seeing Germany now, for example, having a huge argument within the traffic light coalition about the next budget because it won't comply with Germany's own debt brake. So they're already talking about cuts to things where actually Germany should be spending more, not just on the green transition, but on defense, for example.
And with the German far right,
strikes you as a bit ludicrous right now.
With the German far right in those European elections leapfrogging the Social Democrats, that argument might be over.
It might be over, it might be over. The CDU, the Christian Democrats, who are likely to win the next election, are, I think, as committed to the debt brake as the Social Democrats. So unfortunately, I don't see this debate shifting anytime soon.
And just 5 years ago, Ben Hall, we saw a spike in support for Green parties across the continent. And today, there's sort of this big backlash. Is that what we're feeling here in France?
Yes, I think there's a little bit of that, although I think in France it is much wider, as we've just been discussing. It's not just about green measures, it's about living standards generally. But I think we have been seeing the beginnings of a green lash, to use that horrible expression. And in Germany, for example, it's clearly the Greens who have been damaged by the bungled law on as you were talking about, alluding to earlier on, about heat pumps, replacing gas boilers with heat pumps, which frightened a lot of the population and was badly communicated and probably over ambitious, frankly. But the real problem is this: is that if we are going to, and I think most of the panelists agree, you need to subsidize the transition for those bits of society that can't afford it. Frankly, that means subsidizing a lot of society, because you're going to have to subsidize the lower middle class and not just the very poorest in society. As we know, the very poorest people don't drive cars generally, but it's the lower middle classes that drive cars, and that's going to be a very, very expensive proposition.
So you have this argument over going green. You also saw with European elections an increasing number of women in France voting far right. Perhaps not the ones who marched on Sunday and in Paris and elsewhere against fears of a rolling back of women's rights if the National Rally does win. Now, if the far left's firebrand leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon touts a 12% increase in the minimum wage to 1,600 euros a month, it's precisely, he says, for them.
Enough empty talk. Minimum wage. Who works for minimum wage? Come on, who? 80% of those working at minimum wage are women. So you're talking about the female wage. Aren't you interested? Don't you know what life's like? Don't you know what it's like? Haven't you heard of single-parent families?
Yeah, those squeezed middle classes, Renaud Foucault, a lot of them are single-parent households, and it's women who run those households in most cases. Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, though, why isn't he the one drawing more women?
Well, I guess people don't exactly know what will be the place of Jean-Luc Mélenchon and of more moderate centrists in a possible coalition that would rule the country. And also, I think Jean-Luc Mélenchon is someone that is a very scary personality. People are scared of him because of his stance on Russia. People are scared of him because the way he seems to approach democracy within his own party. But also in terms of economics, like you talked about the increase of 12% in minimum wage. At the same time, he says, but we should also give money to companies to pay for those 12% increase. It doesn't seem to be very well out at the moment, the far left program, exactly like the right, except that the far left is not supposed to be dominant in any government. They would need anyway Social Democrats and Green.
Cyprien Battu, the left's policies, are they as unrealistic as the far right's?
I think what we have to keep in mind was that it was a political compromise that was made in 2 or 3 days, just after the call from
this
Macron.
alliance, I'll just spell it out for our viewers. It was the Socialists, the Greens, the Communist Party, and the far left France Unbowed of Jean-Luc Mélenchon.
Yes, and they all hate each other, more or less. So they had a lot of compromise to do in a very few days. So, and this program reflects that. Okay, so there's a lot of different measures to please everyone.
So wait a minute, are you saying the same thing as was said about the far right? Don't pay too much attention to their policies because they're going to flip-flop anyway. Are you saying the same thing about this left-wing alliance?
No, I wouldn't say that. I just wanted to say that you need to look at more more of the signal that it sends, this program. That is a break from the policies by the previous governments and the will to finance new spendings through tax increase. And that is not the case from the two other parties. When you look at the previous government program, they don't want to increase taxes. And if you look at the far right parties, they want to reduce taxes. Okay, so that's one thing that is different. And I think we should focus on that. So the will to finance new spendings through tax increase. Yes.
And Ben Hall, at face value, a party that says the rich should pay their fair share. What's wrong with that?
Well, I mean, I agree that the difference between the left-wing bloc and the far right is that they claim to have a financed program because of these big tax rises. I think the big problem with it is that it underestimates the impact it will have on the private sector, because you will have large-scale capital flight from the country. You will have companies that decide not to invest here. And I think it will have a very big dampening effect on economic sentiment and economic activity in France. And so overall growth will suffer and the pie will be smaller and harder to divide up and benefit all the people that we've been talking about. So I think that's the unrealistic bit of their program, is that they underestimate the extent to which this will affect the private sector economy and affect it rather badly.
And by the way, since this weekend, Economist's Twitter has been on fire. The former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, Olivier Blanchard, turning heads with several threads where he takes apart all of the three main blocs' campaign promises, while arguing that the far right's the lesser of two evils compared to that of the NFP, as it's called, the New Popular Front, stating that the RN's economic program's a Christmas tree without logic or coherence. The New Popular Front's economic program is instead mostly internally coherent, based on an epical redistribution from rich to poor and from firms to worker. Why does he then say, Francesco Saracino, that the far right is the lesser of two evils when it comes to its economic bloc?
I think for the very same reasons that were just said. I mean, that according to him, the Popular Front...
And this is from a guy who calls himself a social democrat.
Yes. And he argues that they underestimate the supply side effect, as we call it in economics, of this package.
So what does that mean? Never tax the rich?
That is the problem. I mean, and this is where I kindly I disagree with Olivier Blanchard on one side. That the program has a different approach, and that is exactly what was just said. I mean, the idea is that you need to also act on redistribution, and redistribution implies, of course, a redistribution also of the fiscal burden. I do believe, and also on that I agree, that we have to take the general philosophy more than the specific measures, because the specific measures, as always happens, will be taken over time. They will be adjusted if they work, and usually programs are then alive things, so over time they change and they adapt to the changing situation. And I also do believe that a major innovation is that this program puts at the center international cooperation, precisely to avoid this type of risks of having one country implementing a certain type of policy and everybody living in that country. So, for example, they insist a lot on the coordination at the OECD level on taxing multinationals. There is already an agreement that is having a hard time being implemented, so they plea to push it. They push for a worldwide tax on billionaires. That is one of the Brazilian presidency of the G20 proposals that they think should deserve more attention. So they're not completely unrealistic. Okay? They know that they live in a world with constraints. They know that these type of policies will potentially have a negative effect on on the, let's say, on the growth potential of the French economy. But they just state a new philosophy, and then I think, they will not go to power because this is not what the polls say, but in case they had to actually implement this program, I'm sure France would not turn into Venezuela in a month.
Renaud Foucault, your reactions to those threads by, again, this is the former chief economist at the IMF, Olivier Blanchard.
Yeah, I think he's very dangerous in what he's saying. So he's looking at the face value of the program, but I think we need to look and be serious about the big picture. Rassemblement National is an authoritarian party. If they go into power, they will put authoritarian people in charge of French media, of French public service, and these institutions are the roots of a well-functioning economy. If the institutions are rotten from the inside, from authoritarian, nothing will work. I think Blanchard should know better and should have said that.
You agree with that, Ben Hall?
I'd say that, to be fair. I think we're probably unfairly representing his views. He was quite clear that there were other reasons to vote against the RN, and I can't imagine that he would think that economic reasons alone would justify voting for the RN over voting for the New Popular Front. And I think he said so quite clearly on Twitter. But I think he clearly thinks that the left-wing program is completely unrealistic in a world of modern mobile capital. In the EU, in a bloc where France already has the highest public share of spending to GDP, public spending to GDP, and tax to GDP, how can it carry on going up that scale and not suffer some kind of impact?
But do you agree there with what was just said by Renaud, that rule of law, for instance, the National Rally has stated that, for instance, those energy measures we were talking about, if they don't agree with them on the EU level, they'll ignore them. If you don't play by the common rules, that's much more important than what your specific economic policies might be.
I would definitely agree with you about that. The biggest announcement today we haven't even discussed already, which was one that Bardella himself did not repeat, but that Jean-Philippe Tanguy, his economic brains, and possibly the next finance minister, if the RN get an absolute majority in these elections, is that an RN government would respect EU fiscal rules and would reach a deficit limit of 3% of GDP by 2027. Now, you can say that you don't believe that, and I certainly don't believe that they would actually do it. But the fact that they're actually saying it, poses a lot of questions about their policy. And I mean, unfortunately, in this snap election campaign of only 3 weeks, I think this is one of the big mistakes of this gamble by Macron, is that there is not enough time to pull apart the credibility of this program. If there had been longer, it may have been more successful.
It's a very short campaign time. Cyprien Battu, it's a short campaign time. People in this room remember that markets can punish you if your economic program is too unrealistic. Do the voters get that?
I don't really think so. I mean, especially in 3 weeks. There are bond vigilantes. We all know about this. We know also about the recently stress episode about this. But in general, in 3 weeks, I don't think people will really care about this issue in particular. We'll focus much more on social issues, and that's what your polls was showing earlier, right? And people will not maybe say that. We'll see that right away.
There is an increase in the number of people who've signed up for proxy voting. So the predictions that turnout will be higher. Francesco Saracino, of course, is next Sunday, the first round. Then there's a second round the week after. Will public opinion shift during that time?
I don't know. No, I agree. I agree that the snap election, the 3 weeks is too short to actually highlight the pros and cons of each of the propositions. So people will end up voting with their guts. And even this proxy voting increase, it needs to be interpreted with some caution, because we are in the middle of, we are beginning the holiday season. So there might be people would have voted, and they simply don't vote because they are not in their residence place. So, I mean, I would be very careful. There will certainly be an increase in the turnout with respect to the European elections, which were not bad, actually, for French standards. Will that be enough to change the trend for Macron's party? That remains to be seen. I'm not an expert in political polls, of course, but I mean, I was struck by the fact that the Rassemblement National is even stronger in the polls than it was at the European election. Of course, they got pieces of the right. They merged more or less with this very far small party that was at their right. So that can be explained. But I mean, they are 35, and there used to be they just polled at 31 at the European elections. In 2 weeks, they actually gained votes. So that is why, I mean, I totally agree. The gamble by Macron was very, very dangerous, and I don't think it will turn out well for him.
Okay, there's a prediction. We'll end on that. Francesco Saracino, I want to thank you. I want to thank Cyprien Battu, Renaud Foucault for being with us from Lancaster, Ben Hall in London. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.